He was sitting across from a table of FBI agents, calm, relaxed, sipping an Americano coffee. And then he said something that made a seasoned federal prosecutor, a man who had seen the worst of the worst, go completely silent. He said, "I want a promise that you'll give me the death penalty. If you do that, I'll tell you about every single person I've ever killed." The agents looked at each other, because this man, this ordinary-looking contractor from Alaska who coached his daughter's activities and built ramps for his girlfriend's dogs, had just told them something they weren't prepared for. He hadn't killed one person. He hadn't killed two. He had buried murder kits across the entire United States, years before he used them, in states he had never even lived in. Waiting, planning, moving in silence while the rest of the world had absolutely no idea he existed. His name was Israel Keyes, and by the time the FBI figured out who he really was, it was already too late to find all of his victims. If this is the kind of story that keeps you up at night, subscribe right now. We go deeper than anyone else. The thing about Israel Keyes is that he looked like nobody. That's not a figure of speech. Investigators who worked his case said it over and over again. He had no type, no pattern, no signature that would ever show up on a database. He was 6 feet tall, physically strong from years of outdoor work, and completely unremarkable to look at. Brown hair, quiet eyes. The kind of guy you'd forget 5 minutes after meeting him. He was born on January 7th, 1978, in Richmond, Utah, second of 10 children. His family started out as Mormons, but that changed fast. When Israel was still a child, his parents moved the entire family to a remote piece of land in Stevens County, Washington. No running water, no electricity. They homeschooled the children and joined a church called the Ark, a white supremacist group tied to a movement called Christian Identity. This movement believed that white people were the true chosen people of God, and that everyone else was inferior. They preached separation, hatred, and radical thinking. His very name, Israel, is believed to have come from this ideology. But it gets darker. Their next-door neighbors were a family called the Kehos, Chevy and Jane Kehoe. The Keyes children and the Kehoe children grew up together. Same land, same church, same homeschool, same ideas. Years later, the Kehoe brothers would go on to commit a mass murder in Arkansas, killing an entire family, including 2 children, in the name of their white supremacist beliefs. This is the world Israel Keyes grew up in. By age 14, he was already showing signs that something was deeply wrong. He was setting fires in the woods, breaking into neighbors' homes, shooting at houses with a BB gun. And then, the detail that made even the people in that community pull away from him, he skinned a deer alive. A former classmate later told investigators that Keyes made my skin crawl. And this was someone who grew up surrounded by extremism. His parents eventually kicked him out of the house as a teenager. They told his younger siblings who looked up to him to never contact him again. He was on his own, and he had already decided what kind of person he wanted to be. At 17, he renounced Christianity and declared himself an atheist. A few years later, he went further. He embraced Satanism, not as a joke or a phase. He was planning what he described as a ritualistic killing. But before that happened, something else did. In the late 1990s, Israel Keyes was somewhere in Oregon, near the Deschutes River, when he saw a teenage girl tubing with friends on the water. She was somewhere between 14 and 18 years old. He dragged her into the woods, he assaulted her, and he intended to kill her. But he didn't. Years later, when FBI agents asked him why, he was completely honest about it. "I was too timid," he said. "I wasn't violent enough. I made up my mind I was never going to let that happen again." Read that again slowly. He wasn't horrified by what he had done. He was disappointed in himself for not going further. That girl never came forward. She has never been identified. To this day, no one knows her name. In 1998, Israel Keyes enlisted in the United States Army. He served at Fort Hood in Texas, Fort Lewis in Washington, and was deployed to Egypt and Israel. He was described by people who served with him as quiet, capable, and slightly off, but nothing that would raise major red flags in a military environment. But while he was on leave in Egypt, he attempted to rape a sex worker. While on leave in Israel, he attempted to rape a college student. His commanding officer later told investigators they believed he had been abused by his own father growing up. When he got out of the army, he moved to Alaska and started a construction business. He became a licensed contractor. He was good at his job. His co-workers described him as a hard-working, dedicated father who couldn't stop talking about his young daughter. He seemed happy. He seemed normal. He was not. Because somewhere during this time, and investigators still don't know exactly when it started, Israel Keyes began building what the FBI would later call murder kits. Picture this. You go to a hardware store. You buy a large plastic bucket, the kind used for construction. You fill it with things: a .22 caliber handgun, extra bullets, duct tape, zip ties, rope, a shovel, latex gloves, and chemicals that can dissolve a body. You seal it shut. You drive to a remote location in a forest somewhere in another state, and you bury it. Then you go home. You don't touch it. You don't think about it, at least not in any way that anyone around you would notice. You go to work. You pick up your daughter from school. You have dinner with your girlfriend. You smile and nod and talk about the weather. And 2 years later, you buy a plane ticket to a city hundreds of miles away from that buried bucket. You rent a car. You drive sometimes more than 1,000 miles to dig it up, and then you use it. That is exactly what Israel Keyes did. The FBI confirmed at least 2 buried caches. One was at Blake Falls Reservoir in the Adirondack Mountains of New York. Another was near Eagle River, Alaska. He hinted at others near Green River in Wyoming and Port Angeles in Washington. He'd buried these kits years before he committed any crime near them. Forensic psychologist after forensic psychologist said the same thing when they studied his case. This ability to wait to bury a murder kit and not act on it for years, we've never seen anything like it. Normal killers, if you can use that word, act on impulse. Something snaps, something triggers them. They make mistakes. They leave evidence. They get caught. Israel Keyes never snapped. He was never triggered. Everything was planned. Everything was controlled. He once told investigators, "I probably know every single serial killer that's ever been written about. It's kind of a hobby." He had studied them all. He knew their mistakes. And he had made sure not to repeat a single one. Drop a comment right now. What's the most chilling detail so far? We read every single one. Let's talk about the Courier murders, because this is where you really start to understand how his mind worked. It was June 2011. Israel Keyes was living in Anchorage, Alaska. He had a daughter. He had a girlfriend. He had a thriving construction business. He also had a murder kit buried in the Adirondack Mountains of New York. A kit he had placed there 2 years earlier. In 2009, he bought a plane ticket. But he didn't fly to New York. He flew to Chicago. From Chicago, he rented a car under his real name. He didn't care. The distance was the alibi. He drove over 1,000 miles northeast, all the way to Essex Junction, Vermont. He had never been to Vermont before. He had no connection to Vermont. He chose it completely at random. On the night of June 8, 2011, he broke into the home of Bill and Lorraine Courier. Bill was 49. Lorraine was 55. They were an ordinary couple, asleep in their beds, in a quiet neighborhood where nothing bad ever happened. Keyes tied them both up. He put them in their own car. He drove them to an abandoned farmhouse a few miles away that he had scouted earlier that evening. The first time he had ever laid eyes on it, he killed Bill Courier first. Then he killed Lorraine. He buried them somewhere on the property. And then he got back in the car, drove back to Chicago, flew home to Alaska, hugged his daughter, went back to work on Monday morning. The Couriers were reported missing. Police searched. Investigators puzzled over the case for months. There was no motive, no connection to anyone they knew, no forensic evidence, no witnesses. And the worst part, When investigators finally tracked down Israel Keyes a year later for a completely different crime and asked him about the Carrier house, he confirmed it. But by then, it was too late. The abandoned farmhouse had been demolished. The debris had been hauled away to a landfill. Bill and Lorraine Carrier's bodies have never been found. To this day, they have no grave. There is something that veteran FBI agents will tell you off the record quietly about Israel Keyes. They'll tell you that in their careers they have interviewed murderers. They have sat across from people who've done terrible things. They have heard confessions that most human beings will never hear. But Israel Keyes was different. It wasn't the crimes themselves, as horrifying as they were. It was the way he talked about them. Calm, clear, almost like he was giving a work presentation. One federal prosecutor who spent months in that interrogation room said he was talking about the murder of this girl like someone else would discuss what they had for lunch. And then Keyes said something else, something that has haunted everyone who was in that room. He said, "This is entertainment for me." He wasn't performing. He wasn't trying to shock anyone. He said it the same way you might say, "I enjoy fishing," or "I like hiking." Entertainment. That one word told the FBI everything they needed to know, and everything they feared. Because if this was entertainment, if this was a hobby, then the real question wasn't just how many people he had killed. The real question was, how many did he kill that we will never ever find? February 1st, 2012, Anchorage, Alaska, 9 p.m. Samantha Koenig was 18 years old. She was working the closing shift at a small drive-through coffee stand called Common Grounds Espresso. It was a cold night, the kind of cold that makes Alaska feel like a different planet. She was alone. At some point that night, a man walked up to the service window. He wasn't a customer. He had a gun. Security cameras inside the stand captured what happened next. The footage showed Israel Keyes climbing through the small window, grabbing Samantha and dragging her out. The whole thing took seconds. By the time anyone noticed, she was gone. The parking lot was empty. The coffee stand was dark. And Samantha Koenig had disappeared into the Alaska night. What nobody knew, what nobody could have known, is that Israel Keyes had a cruise booked. Not in a week, not in a few days. The next morning, he had planned a 2-week Gulf of Mexico cruise with his family months in advance. And nothing, not even what he had just done, was going to change those plans. He left Samantha's body in a shed behind his house. And the next morning he boarded the cruise ship. He sailed. He ate at the buffet. He watched sunsets from the deck. He smiled in family photos. For 2 weeks he was just a dad on vacation. When he came back to Anchorage on February 18th, he went straight to the shed. What he did next is one of the most disturbing details in a case full of disturbing details, so we'll say only this. He prepared Samantha's body to look alive. He took photographs of her holding a recent copy of a newspaper, and he sent those photographs to her family with a ransom demand for $30,000. He wanted the money wired to a debit card. Then he would withdraw it in cash from ATMs as he traveled across the country. That was his first mistake. The FBI and Anchorage police tracked every single ATM withdrawal. State by state, city by city, they followed the card like a trail of breadcrumbs. Texas, Arizona, New Mexico. On March 13th, 2012, 6 weeks after Samantha disappeared, a team of law enforcement officers spotted Israel Keyes in the parking lot of a Cotton Patch Cafe in Lufkin, Texas. They arrested him. He didn't run. He didn't fight. He looked at the officers surrounding him and said nothing. He was completely calm. What the FBI expected was a straightforward case. They had the security camera footage. They had the ATM trail. They had Keyes in handcuffs. They figured this would be simple. Charge him, convict him, done. But then the interviews started, and everything changed. In that small interrogation room in Anchorage, FBI Special Agent Jolene Godin sat across from Israel Keyes and began asking questions. She was experienced, professional. She had done hundreds of these interviews. Nothing prepared her for this one. Keyes didn't lawyer up immediately. He talked. But the way he talked, the things he said, the way he said them, made the agents feel like they were the ones being studied. He told them he had committed other crimes, not just Samantha Koenig. He told them there were others, other people, other places, other states. And he would tell them everything, but only if they promised him the death penalty. Let that sit for a second. Most people who commit crimes try everything they can to avoid the death penalty. They bargain down. They cooperate in exchange for life sentences, reduced charges, anything to stay alive. Israel Keyes wanted to die, and he was using the truth as his bargaining chip. Federal prosecutor Frank Russo was in that room, a man who had built his career prosecuting violent criminals. He later said that the day Keyes first started confessing went from a very happy day as a prosecutor to one of the worst I've ever had. Because with every answer Keyes gave, a new question appeared. And some of those questions have still never been answered. Over the next several months, Keyes sat for more than 40 hours of recorded interviews. He was given Snickers bars, Americano coffees, specific cigars, small comforts he requested and received. He wasn't hostile. He wasn't erratic. He engaged like a man who had been waiting a long time to finally have a real conversation. He told them about the Carrier murders in Vermont, the buried kit, the 1,000-mile drive, the abandoned farmhouse. He told them about the Oregon attack in the late 1990s, the girl whose name nobody knows. He described his burial sites, the hidden caches of weapons and tools scattered across the country like a personal map of destruction. He told them he had committed bank robberies to fund his travels so there would be no card transactions. No digital footprint, no way to trace his movements. And then he said something that froze everyone in the room. He said, "I've known since I was 14 that there were things I thought were normal and okay that nobody else seemed to think were normal and okay." He wasn't asking for sympathy. He wasn't explaining himself. He was simply stating a fact, the way you'd state your address or your birthday. This is who I am. This is who I have always been. Agent Godin later said, "I haven't seen anything like it." And she meant the whole thing, not just what he did, but the way he understood himself. The way he sat in that room with total clarity about exactly what kind of person he was. He told them he had studied serial killers the way other people study history or science. He could name them all. He knew their methods, their mistakes, their psychology. He had decided long ago which ones he admired and which ones he thought were sloppy. The one he identified with most, Ted Bundy. Not because of how Bundy killed, but because of how Bundy waited. How Bundy controlled himself. How Bundy lived a normal life on the outside while carrying something monstrous on the inside. Keyes believed he had done it better. And the terrifying thing is, he wasn't entirely wrong. Then the investigator showed him a photograph. Her name was Deborah Feldman. She was 48 years old. She had vanished from Hackensack, New Jersey in April 2009. Her case had gone cold. No suspects, no leads, no body. They placed the photo on the table between them. Israel Keyes went quiet. And then, for the first time in 40 hours of interviews, his hands started shaking. He stared at the photograph for a long moment. Then he said very quietly, "I don't want to talk about her yet." Frank Russo watched this happen from across the table. He said, "Given the way he looked at it and he started shaking a little bit, I would say she is definitely one of his victims." But Keyes never confirmed it. He held that name back. He held it like a card he was saving for later, for the right moment, for the right deal. The right moment never came. On May 23, 2012, Israel Keyes was in court for a routine hearing. His hands were cuffed in front of him. At some point, the guards noticed something strange. Keyes had shaved small curls of wood off a pencil, slowly, quietly, over days, and had used them to pick the lock of his handcuffs. He made a break for it inside the courtroom. U.S. Marshals tackled him. They tasered him. He went down. He was returned to his cell at the Anchorage Correctional Complex. Security was tightened. The interviews continued. But something had shifted. The FBI was in a race against time. They knew Keyes had more victims. They knew some of them might still be identifiable. They were trying to extract as much information as possible before something went wrong. Something went wrong. On the morning of December 2nd, 2012, guards at the Anchorage Correctional Complex found Israel Keyes in his cell. He had obtained a razor blade. He had used it on his wrists. And he had used a bedsheet rolled tightly to strangle himself. He was 34 years old. The FBI had lost their only source. But beneath his body on the floor of his cell was something they hadn't expected. 4 pages of yellow legal paper, handwritten in the hours before his death. The pages were soaked in blood so badly that they had to be sent to the FBI Forensic Laboratory in Virginia just to be read. It was not a goodbye letter. It was not an apology. It was a poem, later called his Ode to Murder. It was written in a dark, almost romantic style, as if he was describing murder the way a poet might describe falling in love. Excerpts were later made public. They included lines like, "Now that I have you held tight, I will tell you a story. Speak soft in your ear so you know that it's true. You're my love at first sight, and though you're scared to be near me, my words penetrate your thoughts now in an intimate prelude." And then, your wet lips were a promise of a secret unspoken, nervous laugh as it burst like a pulse of blood from your throat. There will be no more laughter here. He also wrote about America, about retirement homes and reality television and mindless work and vanity. He wrote like a man who had spent his entire life watching ordinary people and feeling nothing but contempt. The last line, written twice like a refrain, "Land of the free, land of the lie, land of scheme, Americanize," also found in his cell, drawn in his own blood on the wall, 11 skulls arranged in a row, and 1 pentagram. The FBI believes each skull represents 1 victim. They have confirmed 3. Bill Carrier, Lorraine Carrier, Samantha Koenig. That leaves 8 skulls with no names attached to them. 8 people who were taken from the world by a man who planned everything so perfectly that even now, more than a decade later, investigators don't know who they are, where they are, or what happened to them. Some may have been reported missing and never connected to Keyes. Some may have never even been reported at all. Some may have families who are still waiting for answers they will never receive. Subscribe if you want more documentaries like this. We are just getting started. There is one more name that haunts this case. A name the FBI has never officially connected to Keyes, but that investigators have quietly pointed to for years. Julie Harris, 12 years old, a double amputee. She vanished on March 3, 1996, from Colville, Washington. A month after she disappeared, her prosthetic feet were found near the Colville River. Her body was never found. Israel Keyes was 18 years old at the time. He was living in the area. He had access to the same remote land, the same forests, the same rivers. Her case has never been solved. FBI Special Agent Jolene Godin, the woman who sat across from Keyes for more hours than almost anyone else, made a public statement after his death. She said, "It won't be easy by any means, and it may take a long time, but I'll never give up trying." That was over a decade ago. The buried caches have not all been found. The unknown victims have not all been identified. The families who are waiting, they are still waiting. Israel Keyes left this world the way he lived in it, on his own terms, in control, taking his secrets with him. He spent his whole life making sure no one could follow him. And in the end, that is exactly what happened. The trail goes cold, the case stays open, and somewhere out there in a forest in Wyoming, or beneath the ground near a Washington lake, or deep in a landfill that was once a farmhouse in Vermont, there are answers that may never come. That is the true horror of Israel Keyes. Not that he was a monster, but that he was a patient one.